I am briefly assuming the duties of the chair while Chair Hassan votes. Professor Realio, Chair Hassan and I helped to lead a bipartisan delegation to Beijing last fall. And our bipartisan delegation unanimously and with force raised directly with President Xi our insistence that China take stronger action to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals from China's chemical manufacturing sector onward, much of it to Mexico, where it's synthesized and the fentanyl winds up on the streets of the United States. What is your assessment of progress or a lack of progress that's been made on China living up to its commitment, which were reinforced at a bilateral meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi, to crack down on fentanyl precursor exports?
So while I welcomed your delegation's visit, we were excited to see the fact that you were there to provide some more pressure, and the San Francisco summit between Presidents Biden and Xi. There were some small incremental steps, but we have yet to see what is going to come of it. I'm in the trust but verify camp, and more importantly, nothing happens in China without the CCP knowing. So there are some arguments that, oh, they can't control the big pharmaceuticals or the big chemical companies are known. It's more the smaller ones that are very hard to, there's always going to be an excuse as to why they're not enforcing. And this is where I think that we need to hold them accountable with regular, verifiable reports on law enforcement actions that they've taken, or more importantly, also for them to share with us their intel on which of the illicit fentanyl and precursor chemical companies they're looking at, and then more importantly, what actions they're taking against them. Then we also spoke earlier in the hearing about the Chinese money laundering organizations. So China makes money on both sides. So it makes money through the precursor chemicals and the fentanyl it sells to the Mexican cartels and others. But then also they're making 1% to 2% on the money that they're laundering, which are US dollars that are very precious to the Chinese who have very limited access to hard currency. So there's not really this interest. Perhaps there's a diplomatic interest because they've been shamed into a corner to make it look like they are playing ball with us. But I think we have to hold them to account much more. It's only been the first meeting was in late January of the new joint kind of working group on fentanyl. But whether it's quarterly or every month even, to see what actions they've taken, that's the question I have as to how true the commitment is, not by word, but by action.
Thank you, Professor. And Mr. Urban, on a bipartisan basis here in the Senate and in the administration, there's a strong will to sustain that pressure on the People's Republic of China to end the export of fentanyl precursor chemicals to our hemisphere and anywhere in the world. Were China to live up to its obligations to end that export business, from what other sources in the world do you expect the gap in the market might be filled?
Sure. So if the Chinese chemical companies were no longer a source of supply for the Mexican cartels, I think the first place they would go is India. I think they would source India as a possible place for their chemicals. If the Chinese lived up to this agreement, I think as the Mexican cartels had to adapt to a different source of supply, whether it be India, Eastern Europe, or another Asian country, it would present investigative opportunities because these are other places where we have joint relationships and work with those other countries like India and on ongoing investigative matters. So that would be the first place I would look for the Mexican cartels to go to.
Well, I'll ask my office to place an inquiry with DHS and DOJ to ascertain whether current law enforcement cooperation relationships are postured to begin those investigations or augment what investigations are already underway now. To what extent are we seeing supply entering the market from sources other than China at this moment?
To my knowledge, there aren't any. the Chinese are still the primary precursors chemical suppliers to the Mexican cartels. That has not changed yet. And there's not intelligence that certainly I'm aware of that indicates that the Mexican cartels are seeking other sources of supply, significant other sources of supply for those chemicals.
Professor, please characterize rest of world demand and consumption.
Fentanyl itself, the U.S. and China and Canada are still the primary consumers of illicit fentanyl, and that's why the rate of deaths are so dramatic in our two countries. We're starting to see, so there's two ways we look at fentanyl. There is legitimate fentanyl that's diverted. These are the ones that you've heard about, stolen from hospitals or someone who actually takes it from the supply chain that's legitimate. Then the one that we're looking at in our hearing today is illicit fentanyl. So I spend a lot of time working in Latin America, so it's obviously in Mexico, but we are starting to see reports of fentanyl being intercepted in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama was a diversion case, and in Colombia. And I work a lot in Colombia, where we're starting to see fentanyl-laced and other synthetic drugs start to appear. Post-COVID, all the discotheques and bars have reopened, which is the point of sale for a lot of these kind of drugs. And we've actually seen the Colombians start to ask for increased awareness and training on how to handle synthetic drugs. And also, you know that Colombia still continues to be the top producer of cocaine that also need precursor chemicals that also come from China. And these are the things that we're looking at. And the other day, on Friday, Secretary Blinken was at the UN in Vienna on a global meeting, basically warning that this fentanyl crisis is coming your way. A lot of it is because there's underreporting, and then more importantly, people don't recognize what a fentanyl overdose looks like. Here in the US, we actually have access to Narcan, and there are ways that the numbers are so high because we're tracking the numbers. Other countries don't necessarily commit a death to an autopsy. That's why other countries that might be experiencing fentanyl-related deaths are not recording them. And the numbers are lower in Canada, I understand, because they don't test for cause of death as much as we do in the United States. But it's concerning as it grows bigger and better. And also the Europeans are expecting fentanyl to arrive for their summer season of the party goers in places like Spain and Greece.
So that was my next question is, given how addictive and lucrative this trade is, why hasn't it penetrated Europe?
It's starting now, and the bigger thing is perhaps they're not detecting it. It's kind of hard to detect because it's usually in capsule or pill format that doesn't emit the odor that the canine units that our colleagues at DEA use can detect heroin and heroin, cocaine, and marijuana that have an odor and that the dogs are trained for. So I was in Spain like 3 weeks ago where they had the first death of an adolescent, 14 years old, with what's called pink cocaine, which is actually a synthetic drug. And now the Spanish are trying to figure out who are the traffickers that brought it there. And we do know that the Mexican cartels are trafficking not just in cocaine, but maybe starting to bring those fentanyl-laced pills as well to a European market. As I mentioned earlier, it costs about 30 cents for these pills to be produced in a lab in Mexico. It's being sold on the streets here in front of Nats Stadium at $15 to $20 for that same pill. Extremely lucrative.
So what is the flow from precursor production to fentanyl production, to trafficking and sale in Europe? Can you map that for us, please?
It's a little bit different. The synthetics that they have in Europe are actually different drugs than what we have. Fentanyl is probably the last to enter the market. The bigger thing is because synthetics produce a much more effective high and a little bit more addictive and are easy to take because it's basically a pill. It's kind of an easier way to be introduced to drugs. And this is the part that I was trying to understand is how could you educate our partner nations about the fear that adolescents and younger people are going to be consuming the way that we do in the United States. But we probably can expect that the same exact routes that are maritime routes that are being used to push cocaine that here in the United States we don't consume compared to before are being shipped to Europe are probably the same exact maritime routes that are going to be used in order to piggyback with these synthetic drugs, including fentanyl.
Dr. Feldbaugh-Brown, your take, please, on the rest of world market and trends in production, trafficking, sale, use, and overdose outside of the United States. I think you need to turn on your...
Sir, you have said, why hasn't it not arrived to Europe? I would phrase it, why hasn't it not yet arrived to Europe? The reality is that there are always significant gaps in drug markets. Essentially, they are a function of traffickers being interested in building a new market. In the 1980s, when the United States started experiencing the cocaine epidemic, there was plenty of coca cultivated in the Andes and plenty of cocaine produced to supply Europe. Yet traffickers were not interested in developing those routes for another decade and a half. As I have mentioned earlier, Mexican cartels are bringing up significant networks around Europe. They are both partnering with Bulgarian, Turkish, Albanian actors. They are also starting to develop methamphetamine production in Europe, in places like the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain. Some of that meth is going for sales abroad, including to Asia Pacific, but those vectors are primary possibilities for shipping cocaine and for shipping fentanyl, and more importantly, for manufacturing fentanyl in Europe. It's also very possible that Chinese actors will be selling either finished fentanyl or other synthetic opioids or their precursors to actors within Europe. So in my view, it's a matter of time before it does hit in Europe, and in a matter of time where traffickers will seek to penetrate highly valuable markets in Australia, New Zealand, Japan.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I was just getting started. One more question, if I might, which is just the bipartisan border security measure co-authored by a member of the subcommittee, Senator Langford, included some provisions to substantially augment our capacity to detect, interdict, and stop fentanyl flows into the U.S. The story of that legislation is well known. Congressional Republicans stopped it in its tracks at the cynical and politically motivated request of the former president. I introduced some legislation last week as a potential stopgap measure to surge fentanyl detection equipment and technology to the southern border. I know, Mr. Urban, that you've touched on the importance of detection technology, technical advances in detection technology during your testimony today. But can you just comment for a moment on what more you think can be achieved if we field sufficient and more sophisticated detection technology at ports of entry?
So ports of entry, obviously we want to detect the fentanyl before it comes in and is dispersed throughout the United States for sale. So the more resources you can surge at the border and ports of entry in order to detect with more sophisticated equipment that's needed, it'll benefit everyone in law enforcement. The second part of this is in terms of equipment that you would push out to the field within the United States. Your investigator narcotics unit needs those detectors so we can efficiently identify the fentanyl to protect the officer, to protect the public. So the more equipment that's being pushed out is a benefit to everybody in terms of efficiently moving forward with investigations and protecting officers as they deal with the threat.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, and thank you all. I have a few more questions, and because I had to leave to go vote, there may be a little bit of overlap, so I apologize.